Important timelines and deadlines in a real estate contract. For most buyers and sellers, the primary focus in real estate contracts is limited to just two pieces of information: the sales price and the closing date. And if you're considering selling your home on the mainline PA, how much of the house will be sold for and when you will need to move are indeed the most important aspects of the contract. But when you are divorcing, the other dates become equally important. I'm Kimmy Rolph, and I have helped many friends navigate the maze of legalities when dividing property. Now, getting back to other items in the contract, there can be a veritable minefield of potential pitfalls, as well as numerous contingencies and inspections that could make the difference between a good deal, a bad deal, or no deal at all. For example, sellers might see a price that puts a huge smile on their face, but then they find later on in the contract that they want a bunch of closing costs to help them, which is essentially the same as lowering the price. In other cases, the sales price and settlement date might be fine, but the contract is chock full of contingencies that could string out a seller, allowing the buyer to withdraw from the contract with no penalty and right up to the day of settlement. Although that might give the buyer a lot of flexibility, as a seller, you may have invested in a new place to live and packed up all of your stuff only to find that the buyers changed their mind. Most of the contingencies must be completed within a certain number of days from the date of the contract of acceptance. And let me take you through the contingencies. Commonly found in the contracts, including the number of days usually allowed for the completion of each contingency. Financing. Nearly all real estate contracts have financing contingencies. So, to identify the number of days the buyer has to make for financing application and the number of days for securing the financing commitment, make an application as easy as possible. And we usually see something like 7 days for this. But financing commitment is more time consuming and can often take 30 days or even more, but it would be unusual for it to take much more than 45 days. With respect to financing, there are a couple of things that buyers and sellers should keep in mind. First off, loan approval doesn't always mean the loan is approved. Lenders almost always qualify a letter of a loan of approval with numerous qualifiers and stipulations. Second, a buyer cannot sabotage their own financing. If a buyer doesn't make a good faith effort to pursue financing or provide false information to a lender, the financing contingency will not allow them to escape from the contract. Third, make sure your agent follows up on the due date for financing approval and gathers the appropriate paperwork necessary to prove that the contingency has been met. Many agents aren't good about this, and a contract could suddenly be in a big trouble if the money doesn't show up in time for settlement. Lenders have their own timelines, and it's hard to make up lost ground if a buyer has been remiss about securing a loan. Home inspections, without a doubt. Home inspections are one of the most frequent reasons a contract fails to reach settlement. So there's an area on the agreement of sale where the buyer can elect certain inspections. And they do, and the number of the days to complete these inspections. Some inspections like mold or radon might take a bit longer than others because laboratory tests might be required. But buyers want to give themselves plenty of time for inspections, whereas the sellers want the time to be as short as possible. If home inspections issues are going to cause a buyer to withdraw, then sellers want to know that quickly so they can get their property back on the market and find another buyer. In most cases, it's reasonable for a home inspection to be completed within 10 days, maybe 14, but it can go even shorter. And once the buyer has notified the sellers of what the repairs, if any, are requested, the seller then has 5 days to respond. If the seller says they'll fix everything, the contract moves forward. If the seller says they'll fix some or none of the items requested, the buyer then has 2 days to decide if they want to terminate the contract or accept the seller's response. Appraisals. Even if a contract of sale isn't contingent on financing, it might be contingent upon an appraisal. The appraisal needs to be ordered within X amount of days, and the key word here is ordered. Ordered is not the same as completed. In fact, nowhere in the addendum does it say how long the buyer has to complete the appraisal or the date by which it must be done. If there is a financing contingency, completion of the appraisal must fall within the deadline for financing approval. But if there's no financing contingency, then a specific date or a number of days from the contract of acceptance must be set to have an end date for this contingency. Other deadlines for buyers. There's often a desire to fashion a contract so that there are ways to get out of it. For sellers, their goal is just the opposite. They want an airtight agreement to keep buyers from jumping ship and wasting their time. In many contracts, there are two other deadlines that they can give buyers the get out of jail free card. One is in the home inspections, and the other pertains to properties, homeowners, or condominium associations. So if you have a homeowners or condominium association, the seller must provide the buyer with a long list of information about the rules, the regulations, and financial conditions of the association. And the contract specifically identifies what must be given to the buyer. So once the buyer has these materials and documents, they have 5 days for the homeowners association and 7 days for a condos association to determine whether or not they want to continue with the contract. And again, so long as the buyer responds in this time frame, they do not need to state a reason for canceling the contract. So consequently, sellers should get this documentation to the buyer as soon as possible, because the clock doesn't start ticking for the buyers 5 or 7 days until they actually have received all of the documents. So as you can see, dates, deadlines, and number of days you have to do something in a real estate contract can mean the difference between a successful transaction and one that doesn't work out like you thought it would. Plus, all the real estate contracts are time is of the essence contracts, which means that a close doesn't count. If you miss a date or a deadline by even 5 minutes, you're in default and the other party can declare the contract null and void. So when you get into a contract, make sure your agent keeps you on the schedule and keeps you appraised to these important timelines and deadlines. The consequences of not doing so can be catastrophic. For more information on this topic and others, please reach out to me or click the link below. I'm Kimmy Rolph, and I specialize in downsizing and transitions just like this one. Let's make this step together. Kimmy Rolph sells the main line and local areas.